I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. Today is the day that AMD launches Raven Ridge, which is its Ryzen-based APU with Vega graphics. This is a big deal because it completes the picture of what we know so far about Ryzen. We've had the desktop processors, we've had mobile stuff, we've got Threadripper, which is more Ryzen, and now we've got the combination of Ryzen CPU with Vega graphics core. A little bit of Vega, not a huge amount of Vega. And the really impressive thing is that AMD is using the same AM4 socket as they've used for the regular Ryzens. So in addition to the CPU that we were familiar with, you now get a graphics core. How's that possible? Why'd they want to do it? What's going on? Good questions all, and we're going to answer each and every one of these questions. The primary question of how can they do this thing is that AMD is using a combination of CCXs, which are modules of processor power, and they link them together with Infinity Fabric. It works spectacularly well. The configuration of the cores, the CCXs inside a Ryzen processor is significant. So the 6-core Ryzen 5s are 3+3. 2 CCXs, 3 there equals 6. The Ryzen 5 quad cores are 2+2. 2 CCXs, each half working. Ryzen 3, on the other hand, is 4+0. 1 CCX fully populated, 1 doing absolutely nothing, as far as we're concerned in terms of processing power. With Raven Ridge, you've got a 4+0 configuration. So the Ryzen 3 2200G has got 4 cores, 4 threads, 1 CCX. The Ryzen 5 2400G has got 4 cores, 8 threads, 1 CCX. That's the difference between the regular Ryzen 5 processor and the Ryzen 5 APU. It's a subtle difference, it's significant because the fact is 1 CCX that's fully working in both Ryzen 3 and Ryzen 5 APU means that the other space can be used for graphics, and that's where you get a chunk of Vega. Now we know about the Vega 64, the enormous monster graphics card that currently sells for an incredible £999, and we know about the Vega 56 that currently sells for an amazing £799. These graphics modules are cut down from those. So the Ryzen 3 2200G has a Vega 8 and the Ryzen 5 2400G has a Vega 11. 64 shaders per Vega, so multiply by 8, 11, 56, 64 to get the full thing, which means that in the great scheme of things, Vega 8 and Vega 11 are a reasonable percentage of those enormous beefy graphics cards, which when you consider it's going into part of a processor is quite impressive. AMD has told us nothing about the millimeter area of the die and indeed the transistor count. Actually, it's worse than that. The figures I've seen in the reviewer's guide basically say it's the same transistor count that you get in the straight Ryzen processor, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we'll just ignore that. Basically, we've got one CCX, which is processor, and the other kind of CCX, which is Vega graphics. They're linked together with Infinity Fabric, and then you put your AM4 APU in your AM4 motherboard. Clearly you need an AM4 motherboard that's got graphics outputs, but that's just common sense. One obvious snag with using this AM4 platform in this way is that the graphics module doesn't have any dedicated memory. It doesn't have GDDR5 such as you typically find on a graphics card, and it doesn't have HBM or HBM2 such as found on certain graphics cards, or indeed on the new Intel with Radeon graphics package. Ironically, Intel would appear to be stealing a march there with AMD graphics combined with HBM memory. So what we've got is a situation where the new AM4 APU is using shared system memory, shared DDR4. And that's a problem because Ryzen operates on relatively slow memory. The dedicated kits we've seen from G-Skill, the FlareX kits, both actually for Ryzen and for Threadripper, so 2 and 4 modules, it tops out at 3200 megahertz. Now the fact is, overclocking memory on Ryzen doesn't seem to yield any benefits worthy of the name. I mean, you always get something more, but nothing obvious. The difference with these APUs is they rely on memory. The memory is quite clearly a bottleneck. And at the moment, there simply isn't an answer to that. Now, we've seen figures from AMD, from their man Sammy Mackinnon, former overclocker who's joined AMD a few years ago, where he's running memory at 3600 megahertz. But what memory he used is something of a puzzle. I tried using G-Skill Trident Z 3600 memory, XMP enabled, absolutely fine. Motherboard understood it perfectly, fired it into life. no joy. So faster memory would yield results. However, at the moment it would appear that 3200 megahertz memory is as fast as you reliably get with any Ryzen platform. That is something of a snag. All this stuff came from AMD, along with this Flare X kit of memory here, which is, as far as I can see, exactly the same as the G-Skill Flare X I've been using along the way. However, this particular gigabyte is not the one in the press kit. That is this gigabyte. This is my gigabyte. Now, I bought this gigabyte as soon as it was launched because I wanted to do some mini ITX builds when I was reviewing cases, and happily I did, because the BIOS in that gigabyte over there, which is an AMD BIOS, it failed me. It just locked solid, refused to boot, no signal, after I've done a bunch of testing, don't understand it, couldn't recover it, even though it turns out actually the gigabyte has 2 BIOS chips, which is a feature that's completely unknown to me. It's not in the documentation, but there is a second BIOS chip on board, and it didn't recover the situation. I got my gigabyte out of off the shelf, didn't have any hope of it working with the unreleased Raven Ridge at that moment. However, Gigabyte had already released a new BIOS for it, installed that BIOS, installed Raven Ridge, worked like a charm. And this was very pleasing. Now, during the testing, one of the wrinkles I ran into was that I was using AMD's Ryzen Master software, version 1.2, which has some new added features for Raven Ridge, obviously relating to the internal graphics. And the fact is that Ryzen Master it's not software I enjoy. When Ryzen was launched, Ryzen 7, I initially ran into problems. This is some versions of Ryzen Master ago, because it was over-reporting by 20 degrees. You may recall the furore at the time. So my system was sitting at 25 degrees, but the temperature reported at idle was 45 degrees. I was convinced I had a problem with cooling. Underload it as rising to sort of about 60, but the software is reporting 80. And this basically meant I did not love Ryzen Master. In addition to that, Ryzen Master puts a load of about 10% on a Ryzen 7 CPU. It's absolutely crazy. Just sitting there monitoring the processor, and 10% load, which is just daft. I have to use Ryzen Master, the latest Ryzen Master, with Raven Ridge. And the hysterical thing was that Ryzen Master with these small CPUs has a 25% overhead, to the extent where when I tried some overclocking and then I forgot to shut Ryzen Master down after the changes have been saved, and it actually lopped 100 points off Cinebench. Now we're talking here in the territory of 500 Cinebench marks for these APUs, so we're not talking a lot, and lopping 100 marks off is a big chunk of change. So Ryzen Master is obligatory. I didn't want to use it. I had no choice. However, I shut it down as soon as I could and used other software to actually monitor what the heck the CPU and the GPU were doing. So there we go. If you're going to get into using Raven Ridge, you're very likely going to have to use Ryzen Master, and I feel your pain, and that's all there is to it. I wanted to see how the graphics compared to an add-in board. Now, Intel integrated graphics are shockingly bad. That's just a fact of life. If you look back, I look back rather at my launch review of Coffee Lake for Kit Guru. I don't think I even mentioned the graphics core other than it has a graphics core. It's just terrible. It can do almost nothing, and if you want to power your 4K monitor, just the Windows desktop is beyond its capabilities almost. When I fired up Raven Ridge, I was pleasantly surprised by the graphics, and then it occurred to me I haven't actually looked at integrated graphics for some considerable time on the desktop. The previous generation of APUs from AMD, Bristol Ridge, which is the A12, so excavator cores, and then GCN3 graphics, so the equivalent of Radeon R7, I never saw it. I last looked at APUs back in the days of FM2, and I've kind of leapt a bit forward, and here we are now with the combination of Zen and Vega. It can do stuff. Now, the obvious question is, can it do enough stuff to make it worth your while? That has to be the thing. If we just accept that AMD ATI Radeon has been able to do the desktop for years. I mean, that's just a given, okay? You can run a really basic Windows PC with integrated AMD Radeon graphics and it works. That's just a fact. You can power multiple displays off it. That is just accepted. As to whether you actually get enough performance, though, to make it worth your while, that's a different story. And the joy of it is that you can. Both the Ryzen 3 and the Ryzen 5, the Vega 8 and the Vega 11 graphics, they do work. They work quite properly. You can, if you really pull back on the settings, you can play games at 1080p or 720p. And the frame rates are in the 30 FPS kind of territory. There are going to be a whole bunch of graphs and figures and such like over on Kit Guru, so this is obviously a generalization. But the fact is, depending on what games you play, you've got a result. If you want to play a more casual game like Rocket League, where you drive around your car and you hit a football and such like with your car, it looks surprisingly good. The Intel integrated graphics suffered, and also they had some peculiar resolutions you had to use. But the Raven Ridge APUs, they do a good job. The graphics look right. The game plays happy. No problem at all. If you want to play World of Warcraft, and I do not play World of Warcraft, you will be surprised to learn you can run around in your cartoony thing as your wizardy thing with your mage stick, and you can fight, worms and such like. You can do it. It's actually not a bad experience. I mean, the game itself I've got no time for, but the experience was perfectly acceptable. Other games like Tomb Raider, you definitely need to pull back the resolution. Ashes of the Singularity benchmark. Does anyone actually play Ashes of the Singularity, or is it just a benchmark? Good question. Nonetheless, it will storm along. It will deliver a visual result. Can't argue with it. Really impressed. Also, temperatures while it's doing it, entirely acceptable. Overall, happy. There are some caveats. The first thing is, if you run the, in this case, the Flare X memory at the default speed of 2400 megahertz, performance is not good. Enable XMP, go to 3200 megahertz, performance jumps up. It's crystal clear the memory is a major factor and you want faster memory. So if you can push your memory onto 3600 in some way, shape or form, or 4000 or whatever, you've got a result in your hands. Now we know that isn't going to happen at the moment, but the more speed you get, the better. The problem here is obvious, which is that memory is currently brutally expensive and fast memory is even more brutally expensive. So you'd need to be absolutely certain the memory is compatible with your AMD chipset motherboard, and that it's going to therefore benefit the graphics. And that is a big question mark at the moment. DDR4 3200 megahertz memory for the APU graphics. Yep, that's necessary. Overclocking the graphics core. Now this was a funny thing. I didn't have any difficulty pushing the speed of the Ryzen 3 APU forward. The Vega 8, I could push it up a bit. Moving the sliders on stock voltage within Ryzen Master worked. Ryzen 5, on the other hand, the Vega 11, didn't want to do at all. Now, I pushed the voltage a bit, and I was being cautious, having already, potentially blown up one motherboard. I pushed the voltage by 0.15 volts, and it made no tangible difference whatsoever. Temperatures were low, everything seemed happy, it didn't want to respond. Now the fact is, this is early days of the BIOS or BIOSes for these boards. It's early days for Ryzen Master and for the graphics drivers. I don't doubt everything's going to change in coming weeks and months. Not for one moment do I doubt that. So I basically chickened out. And then things got slightly more interesting, and I installed first an RX 550 graphics card from Sapphire, their Pulse, and also this RX 560 graphics card, also a Pulse, also from Sapphire. Now, Kit Guru doesn't generally deal with low-end graphics cards. The 550 is the sort of thing that's just off our radar altogether. The 560 is in that kind of getting interesting, 570 sure thing, 580 lovely. And it really doesn't help the graphics card manufacturers' cause that pricing is just stratospheric at the moment. Now, depending whether you go for a 2GB or 4GB card, you can get the 550 for around the £110 mark. The 560 is likely to cost you more like 160. But whatever I'm saying about pricing, for goodness sake, check, because there are different specifications, different SKUs, different amounts of memory, and it's all up in the air. The point being is that a card that once upon a time I would have hoped would have been 70 or 80 quid is now past 100, and a card I would hope to be around the £99 or £109 is now north of 150. So that's awkward to say the least. But the point is that on paper, the APU cores, the Vega cores in these APUs appeared to be about the same spec as the RX 550. It appeared to be they'd taken the graphics core, I mean this is a Polaris graphics core, but the spec of the thing, and that they'd shoehorned it into one of these APUs. And the fact is that the RX 550 gives you a healthy increase in performance. Now that can only be down to the combination of onboard memory and proper PCI Express connection equals happy, whereas working internally, and then going out to system memory for the APU gives an overhead. It gives a limitation. It gives a bottleneck. So the RX 550 is actually an upgrade for these APUs. As to whether the RX 550 is enough of an upgrade to make it worth your while, that's a completely different question. It does give a benefit. It doesn't give a massive benefit. The RX 560, yep, that's getting good. But the point then is you're spending serious money. And that takes us full circle back to the beginning. Why the heck would anybody buy an APU? And the answer is because everything costs blooming money. If you build a PC, now it doesn't have to be Mini ITX, but why not? After all, this has a PCI Express slot, it's got memory slots, it's got all the power connections, it's got all the features you want, including Wi-Fi. Why not Mini ITX? Who needs a big chunky PC? And then you power it off the APU using those graphics, and then when you got a bit more cash, you can then buy yourself a graphics card. And whether you buy yourself a just over £100 RX 550, or whether you buy yourself a just over £150 RX 560, or whether you push up to £300 for the bigger Polaris cards, or whether you go all the way, and what was that Star Wars Titan XP, £999 now, which frankly is in the same market as a GTX 1080 Ti. It's all crazy money. Or indeed a Vega 64 if you want to spend £1,000. That's a massive spread of prices. 110 up to 1,000. How thick's your wallet? That's the question, or how many zeros in your credit card. And then you have to ask yourself, do I have enough processor power? And that's the eternal conundrum. The fact is, a great many people are going to be entirely happy with a quad-core processor, whether it's 4 threads or 8 threads, Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, different question, and those baby graphics. That little Vega graphics core is not bad. If you want to power proper games and at higher resolutions, absolutely you need an add-in board. We've always said that at Kit Guru. We're not advocates of APUs and integrated graphics, but we recognize their worth. We recognize not everyone's got a fortune to spend, and that's just a fact of life. So, if you're building a basic PC, these Raven Ridge APUs actually do a very fine job. If you want to get into the whole AM4 platform, again, you're there. If you then choose to upgrade the graphics or indeed ditch the APU in favor of a CPU and graphics, that works as well. The overall takeaway I've got is this. The Ryzen 3 2200G essentially has a processor that is the same as the Ryzen 3 1300X. The pricing we've been given so far for the Ryzen 3 2200G APU is $99 US. Now let's just say it's £99 for argument's sake. You'd hope it's a bit less, but let's say £99. The Ryzen 3 1300X is £113. Now the actual pricing doesn't really matter much, but that Ryzen 3 processor is more expensive than the Ryzen 3 APU, and the Ryzen 3 APU comes with a graphics core that works. So if you're looking at buying a Ryzen 3 1300X, unless you have some plans for mental crazy overclocking, my advice is forget about the processor, buy yourself the Ryzen 3 2200G. Match it with some decent memory, run the memory fast, maybe tickle the graphics up a bit, be happy. Very cheap way to build an AM4 PC. Slightly more complicated when it comes to the Ryzen 5. The processor in the Ryzen 5 2400G is actually better, in my opinion, than the Ryzen 5 1500X quad core. The speed is that little bit better. And to be honest, overclocking a Ryzen 5 1500X, you can do it, but it doesn't seem to me there's any benefit. I mean, you get a bit of extra speed. It doesn't really yield any direct tangible results. It does inside Cinebench. You can get benchmark results, but day to day, it doesn't yield any benefits. So forget about that. The snag for me is that the Vega 11 graphics core doesn't actually give any extra performance than the Vega 8 core that's been overclocked. And that is a bit of a problem, because it means unless you're going to do something that actually benefits from the 4-core 8-thread SMT aspect of the Ryzen 5 2400G, you might just as well go for the Ryzen 3 2200G with the 4-core 4-thread no SMT, because the graphics power is essentially the same. That could all change if AMD sorts out Ryzen Master or does something that means that the Ryzen 5 graphics core overclocks as well. Whether that's going to happen remains to be seen. As things stand, personally, if I was picking one of these two APUs, I'd pick the Ryzen 3. And the reason, apart from the else, is pricing. So $99, call it £99, $169, call it £169. That's a lot extra for an extra 4 threads. In Intel terms, before they went to Coffee Lake and the 6-core thing, but back in the quad-core days, that's the difference between Core i5, Core i7. How much are you going to pay for those extra threads? Does it really yield a benefit? We know that Core i5 overclocks like Bilio and delivers performance. And to my mind, in this instance, it's much the same thing with Ryzen 3. It's a really good little APU, and at $99, £99, really generates some good results. The more expensive, bigger Ryzen 5 APU, I remain to be convinced. It's not bad, it just doesn't seem to have any particular advantage, and for the extra money it blooming well should do. To my mind, the Ryzen 3 APU delivers all the benefits that you get from the Ryzen 5 APU at a lower cost. If you look on paper, you can certainly see the Ryzen 5 has some benefits, but I would suggest if those are sort of benefits you're after, you're actually better off getting a proper CPU and then putting a proper graphics card in, which obviously costs more money. The upgrade path is certainly there with either of these APUs and a motherboard, the PCI Express slot, but the Ryzen 3, you can install it and stop and be happy. The Ryzen 5 is really for the person that wants to go somewhere else, upgrade, in which case, frankly, they do better to skip this and move straight on in the first place. As to how much money they're going to spend on the graphics card, well, that's a different story. But I was impressed that that little RX 550 did a good job, and the RX 560 did a really nice job. Even in these days of horribly inflated graphics card prices, they turned out to be an unexpected pleasure. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. I'm Leo Waldrop for Kit Guru. This is AMD Raven Ridge.